The photograph was taken at 0347 on the morning of November 12, 1998. In it, you can see the port rail of the Bering Dawn, slick with spray and barely visible in the harsh white glare of the deck lights. You can see the hydraulic line stretching up from the pot launcher, taut with the weight of something suspended far below the frame. And clinging to that line, roughly 8 feet above the waterline, where the foam gives way to open air, you can see a shape that does not belong to any species cataloged in the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Registry. The image is blurred, taken in haste by hands that were shaking so badly, the photographer would later say he was surprised the camera didn't fall from his grip entirely. But what it captured was clear enough to destroy a man's career, his marriage, his friendships, and very nearly his sanity. The creature's eyes are open in the photograph. They are looking directly at the camera, directly at the man holding it, with an expression that those who have seen the image describe not as fear or surprise, but as something far more unsettling: recognition. 3 seconds after the shutter clicked, Captain Dale Matheson gave the order to cut the line, and whatever had wrapped itself around, that rope slipped back into the black waters of the Gulf of Alaska without a sound. But cutting the line did not end the encounter. It only signaled to whatever was waiting below that the men aboard the Bering Dawn had seen something they were never supposed to see. What rose from the depths in the hours that followed would test 7 experienced fishermen in ways that no storm, no mechanical failure, no act of nature had ever tested them before. To understand what happened on that November night 40 miles southwest of Kodiak Island, and to understand why one photograph taken by a 24-year-old deckhand could cost him everything he had ever worked for, we need to go back to the beginning of a king crab season that should have made 7 men wealthy. Instead, it made them witnesses to something that the waters off Kodiak had kept hidden for a very long time. And it taught them that some secrets are kept not because no one has ever discovered them, but because those who discover them learn very quickly to stay silent. The Bering Dawn was a 125-foot king crab vessel, steel-hulled and purpose-built for the brutal conditions of the Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea beyond. She had been working these waters since 1984, originally commissioned out of Seattle and sold twice before Dale Matheson purchased her in 1991 for a price that had required him to mortgage everything he owned. By 1998, he had paid off that debt through 7 seasons of hard fishing, and the Bering Dawn was as free and clear. She was not a pretty boat, not the kind of vessel that appeared in documentaries or drew crowds at the dock. Her paint was faded, her superstructure showed the scars of decades in harsh conditions, and her interior smelled permanently of diesel fuel, salt, and the particular musk of men who worked too hard to worry about comfort. But she was solid, she was reliable, and in the hands of a skilled captain, she was as safe as any vessel working one of the most dangerous fisheries on Earth. Captain Dale Matheson had been running crab since he was 19 years old, starting as a greenhorn on a boat whose name he rarely mentioned, and working his way up through the ranks until he could afford to buy his own vessel. By 1998, he was 46 years old, a quiet man with a weathered face and the kind of reputation that mattered in Dutch Harbor and Kodiak alike. He paid fair, he fished hard, and most importantly, he brought his crews home alive. In 23 seasons of commercial fishing, he had never lost a man overboard, never called a mayday, never once cut a trip short due to anything other than weather. That record meant something in a fishery that killed more men per capita than any other occupation in America. It meant that when Matheson put out word that he was hiring for a season, experienced hands applied. It meant that his crew trusted him when conditions turned bad and decisions needed to be made fast. It meant that for 23 years, Dale Matheson had earned the right to call himself a survivor. The crew he assembled for the November 1998 opener was a mix of veterans and relative newcomers, 7 men in total, including Matheson himself. His deck boss was Ray Tillman, a 52-year-old former Navy man who had worked the Bering Dawn for 11 consecutive seasons and served as Matheson's closest friend on the water. Tillman had seen action in Vietnam, had spent 20 years in the service before retiring to a fishing career that he described as more dangerous and less appreciated. He was the kind of man who did not rattle easily, who approached every crisis with the methodical calm of someone who had already survived the worst that life could throw at him. The engineer was Larry Vance, a 44-year-old Oregonian who kept the vessel's twin Caterpillar diesels running with an almost obsessive dedication. Vance was not a man who socialized easily with the deck crew. He spent most of his time below, monitoring gauges and listening to the engines with the attention of a doctor monitoring a patient's heartbeat. But when something mechanical failed, Vance could fix it faster than anyone Matheson had ever worked with. And in a fishery where equipment failure killed almost as many men as the sea itself, that skill was worth more than friendship. The deck crew consisted of 4 men who would haul the pots, sort the catch, bait and stack, and work 18-hour shifts in conditions that would break most people within days. Marcus Webb was 34, a Kodiak native who had been fishing since he was old enough to work, a man who spoke rarely and worked relentlessly, and seemed to find something like peace in the brutal rhythm of the job. Tommy Sandoval was 31, originally from Anchorage, a family man with 2 young daughters who fished crab because it paid better than anything else, and who sent most of his earnings home to a wife who worried about him constantly. Mike Chun was the oldest of the deckhands at 47, a commercial fisherman since the age of 16 who had worked salmon, halibut, longline, and crab across 3 decades on the water. He was quiet in the way that very experienced men often are, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that most things did not need saying. And then there was Pete Kowalski. At 24, Kowalski was the youngest man on the Bering Dawn by a margin of 7 years. He was working his 3rd king crab season, still new enough to the fishery that he felt the excitement and romance that the veterans had long since buried beneath exhaustion and routine. He had grown up in Wisconsin, far from any ocean, and had come to Alaska after dropping out of community college with vague dreams of adventure and good money. The adventure had turned out to be mostly cold and fear and vessel aches that never quite went away. But the money was real, and Kowalski had proven himself reliable enough that Matheson kept hiring him back. He had brought a disposable camera on this trip, one of those yellow Kodak waterproof models that tourists bought for beach vacations. His plan was to document the season, to capture images of the work and the waves and the camaraderie that he still found romantic despite everything. None of the other men paid much attention to the camera. They had seen greenhorns with cameras before, and the cameras always ended up forgotten in a jacket pocket once the real work started. They had no way of knowing that this particular camera would become the most consequential object aboard the vessel. They had no way of knowing that one photograph would change everything. The Bering Dawn departed Kodiak on November 9, 1998, under clear skies and a forecast that promised moderate seas for the first 48 hours of the trip. The plan was to run southwest toward a string of pots that Matheson had set during the pre-season soak, a stretch of seafloor roughly 40 nautical miles from Kodiak Island, where the continental shelf dropped away and the depths plunged to 600 feet or more. It was good crab ground, productive and relatively unpressured, the kind of location that a captain shared with no one outside his own crew. As the lights of Kodiak faded behind them, growing smaller until they were just a glow on the northeastern horizon, an old woman standing on the fuel dock watched the Bering Dawn pull away. According to Kowalski's later account, she was native Alaskan, small and weathered, wearing a coat that looked older than he was. She made the sign of the cross as the vessel cleared the breakwater, a slow and deliberate gesture that she held until the Bering Dawn was well out into the channel. When Kowalski mentioned this to Ray Tillman, wondering aloud what it might mean, the deck boss simply shrugged. Superstitious locals were as common as seagulls in fishing towns, he said. Old women crossed themselves for boats every day. It meant nothing. But Kowalski noticed that Tillman did not look back at the dock as he said this. None of the veterans did. It was as though they preferred not to acknowledge the gesture at all, as though pretending they had not seen it would somehow make it less significant. Kowalski told himself that Tillman was right, that it meant nothing. He told himself this several times over the next 2 days. He did not quite believe it. The first day of fishing proceeded without incident, the crew falling into the brutal rhythm that defined king crab work in the Gulf of Alaska. The pots came up heavy with legal males, the sorting went smoothly, and the hold began to fill with the methodical efficiency that made the Bering Dawn one of the more profitable boats in the Kodiak fleet. By the evening of November 10th, they had hauled 63 pots and were running ahead of Matheson's projected schedule. The mood in the galley that night was cautiously optimistic, the kind of quiet satisfaction that experienced fishermen allowed themselves before the weather or the catch or simple bad luck reminded them that the sea owed them nothing and would take everything if given the chance. What none of them mentioned, though several would later admit to noticing, was that the sonar had been showing strange readings since mid-afternoon. Larry Vance, who monitored all the vessel's electronic equipment from his station in the engine room, had reported the anomaly to Captain Matheson shortly after 1600 hours. The fish finder was picking up signatures that did not match the typical profiles of any species common to these waters. They were too large to be the rockfish and halibut that sometimes appeared on the display, too small and too numerous to be whales, and moving in patterns that suggested neither schooling behavior nor the random drift of marine mammals passing through. The shapes were holding position beneath the Bering Dawn at depths between 200 and 400 feet, rising and descending in what appeared to be deliberate patterns, never approaching the surface, but never sinking beyond the range of the sonar either. Matheson had studied the display for several minutes, watching the signatures move, trying to match what he was seeing with anything in his 23 years of experience. He could not. Finally, he told Vance to note it in the log and continue monitoring. His official explanation was that the equipment might be malfunctioning, possibly due to temperature differentials in the water column or some kind of interference from the seafloor below. His unofficial suspicion, which he shared with no one, was that something about those shapes felt wrong in a way he could not articulate even to himself. They were moving with what appeared to be purpose, circling the Bering Dawn at a distance of perhaps 300 yards, never approaching closer, but never falling behind as the vessel worked its way along the pot string. It was as though they were watching. It was as though they were waiting for something. By 2,200 hours, the shapes had vanished from the sonar entirely, as suddenly as they had appeared, and Matheson allowed himself to believe that whatever they had been, they were gone. He would learn how wrong he was within a few hours. The crew worked through the night, hauling pots under deck lights that turned the spray into diamonds and the men into moving shadows. The November darkness in the Gulf of Alaska is absolute, a blackness that seems to swallow the vessel whole and reduce the entire world to the small circle of illumination cast by the boat's own lights. Beyond that circle, there is nothing but the sound of the waves against the hull and the groaning of the steel under pressure, and the wind that never truly stops, even on the calmest nights. It was Tommy Sandoval who first noticed that something had changed. He mentioned it to Marcus Webb at approximately 0130 on November 11th, during a brief pause between pots while the hydraulic line was being reset. The sea around them had gone unnaturally quiet. The gulls that typically followed fishing vessels, hoping for scraps and offal, and the occasional fish that escaped the sorting table, had disappeared entirely. Sandoval had not noticed them leaving. They had simply been there, and then they had not been there, and the absence felt significant in a way he could not explain. The surface of the water, visible only in the deck light's farthest reach, showed none of the typical signs of life that fishermen learned to read instinctively after years on the water. No fish breaking the surface to feed. No seals curious about the catch. No dolphins riding the bow wake. No whales spouting in the distance. No jellyfish drifting past in the current. Nothing but black water stretching in every direction, still as a mirror, despite the gentle swell that moved beneath them. Webb shrugged off the observation, attributing it to the late hour and the exhaustion that accumulated after 18 hours of continuous work. The fish had gone deep, he said. The seals had found better hunting elsewhere. The gulls would be back by morning. There was nothing unusual about a quiet night on the water. But Sandoval could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. He described it later as the sensation of being a diver in a tank, aware that something on the other side of the glass was studying you with an attention that felt distinctly predatory. When he glanced toward the darkness beyond the rail, he saw nothing, but the nothing seemed to be looking back. The explanation they settled on was weather. Perhaps a pressure change had pushed the wildlife to deeper waters. Perhaps the unusual warmth of the current, which Vance had noted in his log, had disrupted the normal patterns. Perhaps it was nothing at all, just a quiet night on a sea that had been fished for 100 years without incident. That explanation was wrong. The pot that changed everything came up at 0312. It was the 47th pot of the night shift, set in 620 feet of water on a stretch of bottom that Matheson had marked as productive 3 seasons prior. The hydraulic winch engaged smoothly, the line spooling up from the depths with the familiar mechanical rhythm that the crew could have heard in their sleep. For the first 400 feet, everything was normal. The line came up at the expected rate, the winch labored with the expected strain, and the men on deck prepared for another routine haul in a night that had been full of them. Then Ray Tillman, who was operating the block and guiding the line as it came aboard, called out a warning that brought the entire deck crew to sudden attention. Something was wrong with the weight. The pot should have been heavy, either full of crab, full of water, and the winch should have labored accordingly. Instead, the line was coming up with an uneven tension, the strain fluctuating in ways that made no mechanical sense, as though the weight below was shifting, redistributing itself, moving in ways that inanimate objects simply do not. Tillman had felt pots come up tangled before. He had felt them come up fouled with debris, caught on rocks, twisted by current. This felt like none of those things. This felt like something was climbing. Matheson heard the call from the wheelhouse and reduced throttle, bringing the Bering Dawn to a near standstill in the water. Through the salt-streaked windows, he watched his crew gather at the rail, their headlamps creating overlapping pools of light on the dark water as the line continued its ascent. The pod itself emerged at 0319, breaking the surface with a rush of foam and displaced air that briefly obscured whatever was suspended above it. The crew's first assumption was that they had snagged something on the way up, perhaps a derelict net or a length of debris that had wrapped itself around the line during the haul. Such entanglements were common enough in these waters, more nuisance than danger, requiring only a few minutes with a gaff hook or a knife to clear. But as the pot rose higher and the line above, it became visible in the harsh white glare of the deck lights. That assumption died in the throats of 7 men who had spent their entire adult lives on the water. Roughly 8 feet above the pot, wrapped around the hydraulic line with what appeared to be deliberate intent, was a figure that the human mind could not immediately process. The shape was humanoid, or at least the upper portion was, with a torso and arms and what appeared to be a head, though the proportions were wrong in ways that made the brain reject what the eyes were reporting. The arms were too long, the fingers too many, and too thin, gripping the rope with a strength that had visibly bent the steel cable where the hands made contact. The skin was the color of a 3-day corpse, a grayish white that seemed to absorb the deck lights rather than reflect them, slick with water and something else that glistened like oil in the harsh illumination. The torso was partially covered in scales of the same silver-gray hue, an organic pattern that resembled a corset or armor grown from the creature's own flesh rather than worn over it. Below the waist, there were no legs. The body tapered into a tail that was easily 6 feet long, muscular and powerful, covered in scales that glinted like tarnished metal in the light. The tail was wrapped around the line in a tight spiral, anchoring the creature in place with a grip that no wave action, no movement of the boat, could have dislodged. The fins at the end were ragged and torn, scarred by what might have been age or battle or both, and they twitched occasionally with small movements that proved the thing was not dead. And above all of this, above the impossible body and the horrifying proportions and the evidence of a physiology that matched nothing in any scientific record, was a face that would haunt every man on that deck for the rest of their lives. The features were vaguely feminine, in the way that a skull is vaguely human. The bone structure suggested a woman's face, stretched over a frame that was not quite right, with cheekbones too high, and a jaw too narrow, and a forehead that swept back at an angle that no human head had ever possessed. The skin was the same corpse gray as the rest of the body, pulled tight over features that seemed too sharp, too defined, as though there was not quite enough flesh to cover what lay beneath. The hair was dark and tangled, plastered to the skull and shoulders by water, hanging in matted strands that looked less like hair and more like seaweed or kelp, organic but wrong, moving slightly in a wind that was not there. The mouth was closed, but as the crew watched in paralyzed silence, the lips parted slightly, and what they revealed was worse than anything else. The teeth were needles, dozens of them, arranged in multiple rows like a shark's mouth, redesigned for a humanoid jaw, sharp and thin and slightly translucent, overlapping in a pattern that suggested they could bite through bone as easily as flesh. The eyes were closed. For perhaps 3 seconds, those eyes remained closed, and in that frozen moment, while the creature hung motionless on the line, and the deck lights hummed, and the waves slapped against the hull, Pete Kowalski reached for the disposable camera in his jacket pocket. His hands were moving before his conscious mind had even processed the impulse. 24 years old, 3 seasons on the water, and some instinct deeper than thought told him that this moment needed to be recorded, that whatever happened next, there needed to be proof, that no one would believe them without evidence. He raised the camera, pointed it at the thing on the line, and pressed the shutter release. The flash fired, a burst of white light that illuminated the creature in stark detail for a fraction of a second, and the creature's eyes opened. They were black and enormous, far too large for the face that held them, taking up space where the temples should have been, and reducing the rest of the features to an afterthought. They reflected no light whatsoever, not the flash, not the deck lights, not the faint glow of the wheelhouse instruments above. They were like holes cut into the fabric of reality, windows into a darkness that had nothing to do with the night around them, a blackness so absolute that looking into it felt like looking into a void that could swallow everything. For a moment that stretched into eternity, those eyes fixed on the men standing paralyzed at the rail of the Bering Dawn. They moved from face to face, pausing on each crew member for a heartbeat, cataloging them, memorizing them, marking them in some way that none of them could have described, but all of them could feel. Then those eyes fixed on the camera in Kowalski's hands. Then they rose to fix on Captain Matheson, visible through the wheelhouse window above the deck. And in that moment of mutual recognition, Dale Matheson had 30 seconds to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. He could order the winch to continue, to bring the pot and its impossible passenger aboard the Bering Dawn. He could examine it, document it, preserve it as evidence of something that every rational part of his mind was screaming could not exist. He could be the captain who proved that the old stories were true, that the sea held secrets that humanity had never managed to catalog. Or he could cut the line. He could send whatever this was back into the depths from which it had emerged, back into the darkness where it belonged, and hope that pretending they had never seen it would be enough to make it leave them alone. 23 years of experience told him that unknown situations in unknown waters killed fishermen. 23 years of never losing a man told him that caution was not cowardice. 23 years of bringing crews home alive told him that some questions were not worth answering. He gave the order at 0322. His voice came over the intercom, flat and calm despite everything. A voice of a man who had trained himself to never let his crew hear fear. Cut the line. Ray Tillman did not hesitate. The emergency knife was in his hand before Matheson finished speaking, and the blade was through the cable 2 seconds later. The tension released with a sound like a gunshot, and the severed line whipped away from the block in a spray of seawater and hydraulic fluid. The pot plummeted back toward the depths, and with it went the creature, its grip still locked around the rope, its black eyes still fixed on the men who had briefly held it between worlds. It did not make a sound as it fell. It did not struggle or reach for the boat or try to grab the rail that was suddenly so close. It simply watched them, those enormous black eyes unblinking and unreadable, until the water closed over its face and the darkness swallowed it entirely. And then it was gone. For a long moment, perhaps 5 seconds, perhaps 5 minutes, no one on the deck of the Bering Dawn moved or spoke. The winch continued to run, spooling empty line that no longer connected to anything. The deck lights hummed and flickered slightly in the way they always did. The sea beyond the rail remained utterly black and utterly silent. Then Larry Vance's voice crackled over the intercom from the engine room, and the words he spoke changed everything. "Captain, you need to see the sonar. Right now." Matheson turned to the display beside the helm, the same sonar that had shown those strange signatures earlier in the day. The signatures, he had convinced himself, were equipment malfunction. What he saw there made his blood go cold. The screen was filled with contacts, dozens of them, rising from 600 feet at a speed that no known marine animal could match, ascending through the water column in what looked horribly like a coordinated response. They were coming from every direction: north, south, east, west, above, below, converging on the Bering Dawn like sharks drawn to blood in the water, like wolves responding to a pack member's call, like nothing Dale Matheson had ever seen in 23 years of watching sonar displays in every condition the sea could produce. The thing on the line had not been alone. It had never been alone. It had been a scout, or bait, or both. And whatever its purpose had been, whatever mission had brought it to that particular pot on that particular line, the mission had succeeded. Because now, rising from the depths with terrifying speed, was everything it had been sent to find. Matheson grabbed the intercom and called down to the deck, his voice still steady, but louder now, sharper, carrying the urgency that he could no longer hide. Everyone inside. Now, move. The crew did not need to be told twice. They had all seen the creature on the line. They had all felt those black eyes passing over them. And now they could hear something new, something that had not been there before, something that made the hair on their arms stand up, and their hearts beat faster despite the freezing wind. Sounds were rising from the water around them. Clicks and whistles, but not like dolphins, not like anything that belonged to the familiar chorus of the sea. These sounds were sharper, more complex, arranged in patterns that felt deliberate, communicative, like a language being spoken just below the threshold of human understanding, like a conversation about what to do with the boat that had stolen one of their own. The deck crew scrambled for the hatch that led to the interior of the vessel, abandoning their stations, leaving equipment unsecured, breaking every rule that Matheson had drilled into them about safety and procedure. None of that mattered now. What mattered was getting inside. What mattered was putting steel between themselves and whatever was rising. Mike Chun was the last man through the hatch, and as he grabbed the handle to pull the door shut behind him, he made the mistake of looking back at the water. They had surfaced at the edge of the deck lights, perhaps 40 yards from the hull. There were at least a dozen of them, possibly more, their pale bodies barely visible against the black water, their dark eyes reflecting nothing, their positions forming a rough circle around the Bering Dawn. They were not attacking, not yet. They were circling the way wolves circle wounded prey, patient, methodical, utterly unhurried. as though they had all the time in the world, as though the men inside the steel box of the boat were not going anywhere. As Chun watched, frozen in the hatchway, one of them rose higher in the water. Its torso emerged fully, gray-white skin glistening in the deck lights, scales catching the illumination and throwing it back in patterns that looked almost like armor. Its head turned toward him with a motion that was too smooth, too controlled, like a predator tracking prey. Its black eyes fixed on his face, and then it smiled at him. The needle teeth caught the deck lights for just a moment, row after row of them, arranged in a mouth that had never been designed for anything but killing. Then it slipped back beneath the surface without a ripple. Chun slammed the hatch shut and dogged it tight, his hands shaking so badly that it took him 3 tries to get the locking mechanism engaged. Inside the wheelhouse of the Bering Dawn, 7 men gathered and tried to understand what was happening. The sonar showed the creatures holding position around the vessel, a ring of signatures at depths between 50 and 100 feet. They were maintaining their distance, not approaching the hull, but not retreating either, just holding, just waiting, just watching from below while the men above watched the screen that showed their positions. Matheson tried the radio. He hailed the Coast Guard on Channel 16, the emergency frequency that was monitored 24 hours a day by stations up and down the Alaska coast. The only response was static. Not the normal static of a clear channel, but something else. Something that sounded almost like the clicks and whistles they had heard from the water. Something that rose and fell in patterns that felt deliberate. He tried the commercial frequencies. Static. He tried the private channels that the Kodiak fleet used to communicate between boats. Static. He tried every frequency the Bering Dawn could reach, cycling through the dial with increasing desperation, and every single one gave him the same response. Nothing but interference. Nothing but those sounds. It was as though the vessel had slipped out of the world entirely, as though whatever was circling below had the power to cut them off from everything beyond the circle of their own deck lights. Larry Vance reported from the engine room that all systems showed green. The diesels were running normally. The electrical systems were functioning. The radio equipment showed no mechanical faults. There was no technical explanation for the interference. But when Vance tried to describe what the static sounded like, his voice faltered, and he had to stop and start again. "It sounds like them," he said finally, "like their sounds are in the radio, like they're talking on every frequency." For nearly 2 hours, the Bering Dawn sat motionless in the water while the creatures circled below. The men took turns watching the sonar, tracking the signatures as they rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost hypnotic. Every 15 minutes or so, one would surface briefly at the edge of the deck lights, just long enough to be seen, just long enough to confirm that they were still there, still watching, still waiting for something that the crew could not identify. Ray Tillman suggested starting the engines, trying to outrun whatever was beneath them, putting distance between the Bering Dawn and this patch of water that had become a trap. Matheson shook his head. He had been watching the signatures on the sonar. They were keeping pace with the vessel's drift, without any apparent effort, matching the boat's movement through the current, as though they were tethered to it. If the Bering Dawn tried to flee, they would simply follow. And the chase might provoke exactly the kind of confrontation that the captain was desperate to avoid. As long as the creatures stayed in the water, as long as they maintained their distance, there was hope. As long as no one did anything to escalate the situation, there was a chance that dawn would come and that things would retreat to wherever they had come from. It was not much of a plan, but it was the only plan they had. At 0515, the pattern changed. The signatures on the sonar began to tighten their circle, rising higher in the water column, approaching the hull with a deliberation that made every man in the wheelhouse hold his breath. The clicking sounds from outside grew louder, more urgent, overlapping in ways that sounded like debate, like discussion, like a decision being reached. Then came the first impact. It struck the hull somewhere below the waterline on the port side. A dull thud that reverberated through the steel and made every man aboard flinch despite themselves. It was not a hard impact, not hard enough to damage the hull or compromise the vessel's integrity. But it was deliberate. And it was only the beginning. A second impact followed, then a third, then too many to count. They were hitting the boat from every direction now, from port and starboard and bow and stern, testing the steel, probing for weaknesses, sending a message that could not have been clearer if they had written it in the sky. We know you are in there. We can reach you whenever we want. We are deciding what to do with you. Tommy Sandoval pressed his back against the wheelhouse wall, his face pale, his hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He was thinking about his daughters, about his wife back in Anchorage, about the promise he had made to come home safe. He was thinking about how far they were from shore, from help, from anyone who might hear them if they screamed. Marcus Webb stood at the window, watching the water beyond the glass, though there was nothing to see in the darkness except his own reflection and the reflections of the other men behind him. His fists were clenched at his sides. If the things came aboard, he would fight them. It would not matter, but he would fight them. Mike Chun sat on the deck with his knees drawn up to his chest, replaying the smile on the creature's face over and over in his mind. It had smiled at him. Those needle teeth and that dead white face had curved upward in an expression that was unmistakably deliberate. It knew what smiling meant. It had learned it from somewhere, and it had used that knowledge to show him exactly how helpless he was. Pete Kowalski clutched the camera in his pocket, the weight of it feeling like evidence of a crime. He had taken a photograph. He had documented what they had seen, and some part of him, some instinct that he could not explain, was certain that the photograph was the reason this was happening. That by capturing the image, he had captured something he should not have. That by preserving proof, he had made the creatures aware that they needed to eliminate everyone who had seen. The impacts continued for nearly 20 minutes, moving methodically from the stern to the bow and back again. Sometimes they concentrated on a single section of hull for 30 or 40 seconds, hitting the same spot over and over until the steel began to ring like a bell. Sometimes they scattered across the entire length of the vessel, a dozen impacts at once from a dozen different directions, as though the creatures were testing how the boat responded to different kinds of pressure. In the wheelhouse, Matheson gripped the helm and stared at the sonar and tried to calculate options that did not exist. He could not outrun them. He could not fight them. He could not call for help. The only weapon aboard was a flare gun in the emergency kit, and whatever use that might be against a single creature, it would be worthless against dozens. All he could do was wait and hope that the steel would hold, that dawn would come, that whatever was testing the hull would decide that the Bering Dawn was not worth the effort of breaching. At 0538, as suddenly as they had begun, the impact stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the pounding had been. It was the silence of a decision reached, of a verdict delivered, of a judgment about to be executed. The sonar showed the creatures descending, dropping back to 200 feet, then 300, then 400. One by one, the signatures faded from the screen until only two remained, holding position directly beneath the vessel at a depth of 500 feet. Sentinels, guards, making sure that the boat did not try to run. Then those two descended into the depths and vanished from the display. By 0600, the sonar was clear. The first gray light of the Arctic dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, spreading slowly across the sky like hope returning to a world that had briefly forgotten what hope felt like. For reasons that none of the crew could explain, the creatures seemed to have gone. Perhaps they were sensitive to light, adapted to depths where the sun never reached. Perhaps the daylight hours were simply not when they hunted, not when they fed, not when they did whatever it was they did with the boats they caught in their waters. Perhaps they had decided that 7 men in a steel box were not worth the trouble after all. Whatever the explanation, the siege was over. The radio crackled to life at 0612, picking up normal traffic from the Kodiak Coast Guard station, as though the hours of silence had never happened. Matheson did not report the encounter. He did not request assistance or relay what they had seen. He simply announced to his crew that they were returning to port immediately, and he pointed the Bering Dawn toward Kodiak at maximum safe speed. The 14-hour run back to port passed in a silence that none of the 7 men aboard would ever fully break. They did not discuss what they had seen. They did not speculate about what the creatures wanted or why they had let the boat go. They did not ask whether the things were afraid of light, or whether they would have breached the hull if the men had stayed longer, or whether anyone else had ever encountered whatever it was that lived in those depths. They simply endured the hours until land appeared on the horizon, and the nightmare could be filed away in the parts of their minds where impossible things were stored and forgotten. When the Bering Dawn finally tied up at the Kodiak fuel dock at 1747 on November 12th, Captain Dale Matheson addressed his crew for the first time since giving the order to cut the line. His voice was calm. His face was unreadable, but his words carried a weight that none of them would ever forget. He told them that what had happened would not be discussed, not with the harbor master, not with the Coast Guard, not with their families, their friends, their drinking companions, their priests. What they had seen was impossible, and impossible things did not survive contact with the rational world. Anyone who spoke of this would be calling himself a liar, a madman, or both. They would lose their credibility. They would lose their careers. They would lose everything they had spent their lives building. Silence or ruin. Those were the only choices. The crew filed off the vessel without a word, disappearing into the November evening to process their trauma in whatever way they could manage. Pete Kowalski went home to his rented apartment, took the disposable camera to a 1-hour processing shop, and discovered that the photograph he had taken was everything he had feared and hoped it would be. The image was blurred, taken in poor light by hands that were shaking badly, but it was unmistakably real. The creature was visible, its body twisted around the line, its face turned toward the camera, its eyes open and staring directly at the lens with an expression that looked disturbingly like recognition. The scales on its tail caught the deck lights in a way that film grain could not have fabricated. The teeth, visible through parted lips, were sharp and numerous and arranged in a pattern that no known animal possessed. It was proof. And Pete Kowalski, at 24 years old, had no idea what to do with it. He should have destroyed it that first night. That was what Ray Tillman would tell him 3 years later, after everything had fallen apart. That was what any of them would have done, if they had been thinking clearly, if they had understood what documentation of such an encounter would mean. Instead, Kowalski put the photograph in a shoebox under his bed and tried to forget that it existed. The silence lasted 3 weeks. The nightmares began almost immediately, vivid and recurring dreams in which the creature's eyes would open not on the deck of the Bering Dawn, but in Kowalski's own bedroom, watching him from the darkness with an attention that felt ancient and hungry. He started drinking more than he should have. He broke up with his girlfriend after an argument about his refusal to discuss what had happened on the trip. He stopped returning calls from his parents in Wisconsin. By mid-December, the silence was eating him alive. What finally broke him was not guilt or fear, but something simpler and more human. He wanted someone to believe him. On December 4th, 1998, Kowalski took the photograph to Dr. Leonard Stowe, a marine biology professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who had built a modest reputation studying deep-sea species in the Gulf of Alaska. Kowalski claimed to have found the image in a box of estate sale items. He asked what it might show. The professor studied the photograph for several minutes without speaking. Then he asked Kowalski to leave it with him for further analysis. Kowalski agreed. It was the worst decision of his life. Within 48 hours, the photograph had been copied and shared with colleagues at 3 different institutions. Within a week, A graduate student had traced the image back to the 1-hour Photoshop in Kodiak. Within 2 weeks, Kowalski's name was attached to the photograph, and his phone was ringing with calls from journalists, researchers, cryptozoologists, and television producers. Captain Dale Matheson learned about the breach on December 19th. The conversation he had with Kowalski that evening lasted less than 5 minutes. The young deckhand was finished in the Kodiak fleet. No captain would hire him. No crew would work alongside him. He had broken the code that held commercial fishing communities together. By January of 1999, the photograph had been widely dismissed as a hoax. The official explanation claimed it showed a decayed seal carcass, misidentified by an inexperienced deckhand with an overactive imagination. Dr. Stowe issued a statement calling the image inconclusive. The other crew members denied that anything unusual had occurred. Matheson called Kowalski troubled and mentally unstable. None of it was true. But truth had ceased to matter. Pete Kowalski left Kodiak in February of 1999. The original photograph disappeared during one of his relocations. The negative was lost in a storage fire in 2003. By the time anyone might have wanted to re-examine the evidence, there was no evidence left to examine. But the story did not end there. In 2001, Ray Tillman suffered a stroke. Facing what he believed were his final years, he began talking to a journalist named Sarah Hendricks. He confirmed everything: the creature, the captain's decision, the sonar showing dozens rising, the siege, the impacts on the hull, the creatures circling like wolves, the dawn that saved them. He died in 2004 without retracting a word. Dale Matheson sold the Bering Dawn in 2002 and never spoke of that night until his death in 2017. Only Pete Kowalski kept talking, giving interviews to anyone who would listen, becoming the crazy mermaid guy from Alaska. He never recovered his life, but he never stopped insisting the photograph was real. The waters off Kodiak Island are still fished today. King crab season's still open in the fall. But most captains avoid that stretch of seafloor 40 miles southwest, where Dale Matheson set his pots in November of 1998. They say the crab moved. They do not mention the sonar contacts that appear on calm nights. They do not mention the gear that comes up with marks that look like teeth. They do not mention the silence that falls sometimes. The way the sea goes quiet in ways that make experienced fishermen lock their wheelhouse doors. What swims in the Gulf of Alaska has been there far longer than any of us. It was there before the first crab boat, before the first Russian explorer, before the first human looked out at an ocean, holding secrets they could not imagine. And it is still there today, waiting, watching, rising toward the surface when boats come, retreating into darkness when boats leave. The photograph Pete Kowalski took no longer exists. But the men who saw what he photographed knew the truth. They carry it to their graves. Some things are easier to deny than explain, and some photographs cost more than the film they were printed on. If you have spent time on the waters of Alaska, perhaps you have heard whispers of encounters like this one. Perhaps you have your own story. The crew of the Bering Dawn were not the first to witness what lies in those depths. They will not be the last. If you have an experience to share, I invite you to leave your account in the comments below. Every story adds another piece to a puzzle that humanity has been trying to solve since the first fishermen ventured beyond sight of land. What waits beneath the waves? What has always waited? For more accounts from the deep, subscribe to Maritime Incident Files.